Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into something that really caught my eye, and probably yours too. A pretty surprising, almost counterintuitive shift in global policy.
Mm,
Just when you think you've sort of got a handle on the geopolitical chessboard,
yeah.
right? One of the main players makes a move that feels, well, unexpected, and suddenly the whole pair looks different.
Yeah, those moments can really reshape things quickly.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack today. We're looking at a really dramatic and very recent reversal in U.S. military aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, a really significant one, yeah.
It's not just some minor tweak in the grand scheme of things. It feels more like a fascinating, almost real-time case study in how fast-moving events, like really fast, can trigger major policy pivots right at the top.
Mm-hmm. It has that feel of a decision made under, well, considerable pressure.
Absolutely. And the speed of it all is something we really need to understand.
Yeah.
So this deep dive, it's built from quite a collection of sources. We've got news excerpts, giving us that blow-by-blow account.
Right.
We have official statements, White House, Pentagon,
Yeah.
and even some insights from people apparently briefed on the process who couldn't speak publicly.
Okay, so a mix of public and sort of behind-the-scenes context.
Exactly. Together, they give us this detailed, almost day-by-day feel for how this specific policy change went down. Let's just kind of piece together what happened behind the headlines.
That should be illuminating.
That's the plan. Our mission for you, the listener, is pretty clear. We want to help you understand what exactly happened with this sudden U-turn,
Right.
why it seemed to happen so quickly, so publicly, and maybe the big one, what it might mean, for the war in Ukraine itself, but also for the broader picture of U.S. foreign policy.
The ripple effects, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to try and explore the layers of decision-making that led to this, well, pretty significant, almost instantaneous shift. So let's get right into it.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's start with the announcement itself. The moment that really signaled this U-turn, it was just recently, on a Monday. President Trump made some very public statements.
Yeah, I remember seeing those.
And they signaled a really dramatic shift in U.S. policy on arms for Ukraine.
Yeah.
His quote, the one that really stuck out, was, "They have to be able to defend themselves."
Very direct. No ambiguity there.
Not at all. It wasn't like some carefully worded diplomatic statement, just direct, unequivocal.
And that directness, I think that's a critical point here. It wasn't hidden in jargon. It was a clear statement of intent, straight from the president. He explicitly said the U.S. would send more weapons, and the reason he gave, Moscow's recent assault on Ukrainian cities, left him with little choice.
So a very direct link drawn there. Event A leads immediately to policy B.
Precisely. It presents this external event, this huge attack, as the undeniable driver for a big policy change happening right now. It feels like policy made in direct response to something urgent and visible,
Yeah, not like some long, slow strategic review.
Not at all. More like a reaction.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because just the week before this, the narrative was completely different, wasn't it? The U.S. seemed to be, well, pulling back support.
That's right. There was that pause.
And then suddenly, a complete flip. The implications were immediate. His comments just seemed to signal a direct reversal from what his own administration was doing days earlier, pausing weapons transfers.
Yeah. And that initial pause had definitely caused some ripples, some uncertainty among allies about U.S. commitment.
For sure. People were wondering if the U.S. was starting to, scale back its support. But instead, Mr. Trump's words on Monday pointed in a very different direction. He even said he'd grown unhappy with President Putin.
Right, because Putin had, in Trump's view, frustrated his hopes of brokering a ceasefire.
That's what the sources say, yeah.
And that brings in that highly personalized dimension of diplomacy, doesn't it? Especially with a leader like President Trump.
How so?
Well, the sources suggest his hopes for a ceasefire, which he talked about, just weren't panning out.
Right, he'd mentioned wanting to make a deal.
Exactly. And this perceived lack of progress, maybe even feeling personally let down in his diplomatic efforts, seems to have directly fueled that public frustration with Putin.
So you're saying it connects the failure of his personal diplomatic approach directly to then pivoting towards more military aid.
It looks that way. It suggests it's not just abstract strategy, but also about his personal assessment of that relationship, that interaction, and whether it was working.
And he was very blunt about the urgency, the human cost, too. He told reporters at the White House, let me get a quote right, "We're going to send some more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard. Now they're getting hit very hard. We're going to have to send more weapons, defensive weapons primarily, but they're getting hit very, very hard. So many people are dying in that mess.
Wow. That's very raw language.
It is very visceral, far from the usual, dry policy speak.
Absolutely. And that kind of language, that visceral description of the motivation, it suggests a really strong, immediate, maybe even emotional reaction to what was happening on the ground.
Right.
When a leader says things like, so many people are dying in that mess, it gives this sense of, well, profound urgency, maybe even a moral imperative that suddenly pushes aside previous calculations.
Like logistics or strategy concerns take a back seat.
Potentially, yeah. It signals that the immediate human cost, as he perceived it, became the main driver for action. It pushes aside maybe other concerns that were dominant just days before. And, that kind of language also helps justify a rapid policy change to the public.
And this wasn't just a throwaway comment. I mean, these statements were a really remarkable turnaround for Mr. Trump personally, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely, given his history.
Yeah, because he's often expressed skepticism, strong skepticism about U.S. aid to Ukraine. So this pivot is even more striking.
That context is crucial.
I mean, just months ago, the sources remind us, he apparently dressed down President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine in the Oval Office, basically saying Zelensky hadn't been grateful enough for U.S. support.
Right. So that history makes the sudden shift really stand out.
Yeah. So for him to come out so strongly saying we have to send more weapons, and with that kind of personal language, it's a huge shift in his public stance, and you'd assume his thinking.
It really underscores that this wasn't just a minor adjustment. It was a sharp break from a pretty consistent, often critical position he had held for a while.
Right.
It shows how powerful immediate dramatic events can be, especially if they challenge a leader's own diplomatic efforts or trigger a strong emotional response. It can really alter a publicly stated position.
It makes you wonder about maybe the volatility of foreign policy when it's so tied to a leader's personal reactions, doesn't it?
It does. Rather than just sticking to a rigid strategic plan, perhaps, it raises questions about flexibility versus predictability.
And the speed wasn't just in the words. The Pentagon confirmed it really quickly, too.
Yeah, that was striking. Late Monday, right after his remarks.
Yep. Sean Parnell, the chief Pentagon spokesman, put out a statement. Said, at President Trump's direction, the Department of Defense is sending additional defensive weapons to Ukraine to ensure the Ukrainians can defend themselves while we work to secure a lasting peace and ensure the killing stops.
So very clear confirmation. The system responded fast to the directive.
It did. It shows a high level of coordination, or at least responsiveness, within the administration once the word came down from the top.
Right. When the president gives a clear order, the bureaucracy can, in theory, move very quickly.
But there was still some fuzziness, wasn't there? The source mentions some ambiguity.
Yes, that's an important detail. It said it was unclear if the weapons whose delivery had been paused, including Patriot interceptors, would now be sent to Ukraine, or whether the military would send different weapons.
Ah, okay. So the direction was clear, send more aid, but the specifics were maybe still being figured out.
Exactly. That immediate uncertainty, even amidst the clear reversal, is key. It suggests that while the overall policy changed, the exact implementation details might have been still in flux, or maybe depended on what was available quickly or what was deemed most critical right then.
That kind of real-time adaptive decision-making.
It's common in a crisis, but it definitely adds complexity for everyone involved, especially the recipients.
Yeah, that ambiguity about which specific weapons, especially those Patriot interceptors that had been paused. That's a fascinating detail. It shows the practical hurdles even when policy shifts fast.
Definitely.
So, okay, we've got this dramatic U-turn, but to really get why it was such a U-turn, we need to rewind just a little bit to the week before.
Right, understand the pause itself.
Exactly. What exactly was this pause in aid that happened right before the reversal?
Well, the White House had actually acknowledged it publicly the week before. They said the administration had paused delivery of some air defense interceptors and precision-guided bombs and missiles to Ukraine.
And they specifically mentioned Patriots as possibly paused.
Yes, Patriot interceptors were explicitly mentioned as potentially among those items, which is obviously significant given how crucial they are for air defense against the kinds of attacks Ukraine was faced.
Right. So it wasn't secret, it was acknowledged, but maybe the full reasoning wasn't clear at the time.
Perhaps not widely understood, yeah. The official explanation provided then by a White House spokeswoman was quite general.
What did they say?
It was described as an assessment of munitions provided around the globe.
That sounds almost routine, doesn't it? Like an inventory check. Something militaries probably do all the time.
It does sound like that on the surface, yes. Standard bureaucratic procedure. But the Pentagon's rationale adds another layer.
Okay.
They specifically cited Pentagon concerns that U.S. weapons stockpiles were dwindling. That suggests something more specific than just a general assessment.
Okay. A resource constraint issue.
Potentially. And interestingly, Sean Parnell, the Pentagon spokesman, also noted that this review of military shipments around the world remained in effect even after the reversal on Ukraine aid.
Oh, that's key. So the stockpile concerns didn't just vanish overnight when the policy towards Ukraine changed.
Apparently not. It suggests this was, and maybe still is, a broader ongoing issue for the Pentagon managing global resource allocation that they continue to grapple with, separate from the immediate decision on Ukraine.
You know, that official line about dwindling stockpiles?
Mm-hmm.
It sounded plausible at the time, maybe a bit routine, but seeing this immediate dramatic reversal just days later makes you wonder, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, were those stockpile concerns really the main driver of the pause?
Oh.
Or maybe just a convenient public explanation for a decision influenced by something else, like other priorities?
That's a really sharp question. It gets right to the core of how policy works in these high-stakes situations.
Yeah.
The speed of the reversal, plus the fact the review itself is supposedly ongoing. It could suggest that while stockpile levels are absolutely a real operational concern for any military.
Sure, you can't give away everything.
Right. But their priority, the weight given to that concern, seems highly fluid. It looks like it can be rapidly overridden by, say, a perceived strategic imperative or a direct presidential order that comes from a different place than just logistics.
There's a constant balancing act. Readiness versus allies versus immediate crises.
Exactly. Between maintaining your own supplies, helping partners, and reacting to sudden emergencies. The assessment might have been totally real, but the importance assigned to it clearly shifted dramatically in a very short time.
It's like a fascinating peek into that internal tug-of-war inside administration, maybe.
I think so. Which priorities win out when push comes to shove?
And then we get this even more specific layer, the behind-the-scenes stuff about how that initial pause actually happened.
Right, the confidential information.
Yeah, from those two people briefed on the pause. They revealed that President Trump himself had directed the Pentagon to review available munitions stockpiles.
And that's crucial, because it shows direct presidential involvement in the pause. It wasn't just the Pentagon deciding based on their own internal numbers.
It came from the top down.
Seems so. Which elevates the pause from maybe just a routine logistical check to something more strategic, personally ordered by the president.
So not just an inventory check, then. A specific directive, possibly linked, as the sources suggest, to other military actions happening around the same time.
Yes, the timing is very suggestive. The sources say this directive came around the time the U.S. carried out bombing attacks on 3 Iranian nuclear weapon sites.
Wow, okay. So that does suggest a potential very direct link. Different operational needs potentially impacting resource decisions for Ukraine.
It paints a picture of a highly reactive, very interconnected policy environment, doesn't it? Where major military actions in one part of the world can quickly ripple outwards and force a reprioritization of resources, impacting decisions for completely different regions.
It's like pulling on one thread unravels something else.
Kind of. And the process internally, according to the sources, involved someone at the Pentagon classifying the munitions in different categories, halted at least some of what was scheduled to be sent to Ukraine.
So a very specific, targeted process within the Pentagon based on that top-level directive.
Yeah, it wasn't a blanket stop, but a more nuanced tactical adjustment based on that order and maybe broader strategic needs at that moment. This level of detail really shows the practical mechanics behind these high-level decisions.
Which makes the reversal that followed just days later even more striking, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It means specific things, like maybe those Patriot interceptors, were deliberately put on hold because of these complex global priorities.
Right.
Only to be potentially taken off hold almost immediately afterwards. It really shows how fast strategic priorities can shift when something big and unexpected happens on the ground, forcing a rethink right at the top.
It's a complex web, absolutely. Cause and effect moving very quickly.
Okay, so we've got the surprising U-turn, and we've dug into the specific context of the pause that came right before it. Now let's focus on the sparks. What were the immediate triggers? What really lit the fuse for this dramatic reversal?
The sources are pretty clear on this. They point to a major event on the Friday, just days before Trump's Monday announcement.
Okay, what happened?
Russia attacked Kiev and other Ukrainian cities with what the Ukrainian Air Force called the largest number of drones and missiles launched in a single barrage so far in the war.
The largest barrage so far. Wow, that's a significant escalation.
Absolutely. Not just another attack. This was unprecedented in scale and intensity, according to the Ukrainians. An event like that would grab immediate high-level attention everywhere.
You'd have to assume so. I mean, that's not just a blip on the radar. That's a massive statement of aggression.
Right.
And the timing. This huge attack came just hours after a phone call between President Trump and President Putin.
That's what the sources indicate, yes. Critical timing.
And Trump's immediate take on that call afterwards. Not good, apparently.
No, his assessment was that the call had made any progress. Described as a blunt assessment, especially for a president who often, described his relationship with Putin in, let's say, rosier terms.
Yeah, that phrasing, blunt assessment, really tells you something, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Signals a real shift in his perception right then. Profound disappointment, maybe?
It seems likely. And what's so telling here is that direct correlation, the escalating violence on the ground, this massive attack happening right after what seemed like an unproductive call with Putin.
Yeah.
It really highlights how fast events can reshape diplomatic stances, maybe even deeply held personal views of leaders. That combination, the failed call, then the devastating attack, it really looks like a decisive moment.
Like it forced a reevaluation.
Exactly, a dramatic one. And Trump's comments later, expressing disappointment, reinforced that. He said on Monday, "I'm disappointed, frankly, that President Putin hasn't stopped." And then added, "I'm not happy with President Putin at all."
You can almost hear the frustration there.
You can. It suggests a really personal reaction that then directly impacted his policy stance just days later.
It really does sound like that massive Russian attack hitting right after that unproductive call was probably the final straw, the thing that just broke the back of the previous policy, or the pause, and forced the reversal.
The timing makes that a very strong possibility, yeah.
But the calls weren't just with Putin, right? There was also a call between Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine on that same Friday.
Yes, also on Friday. And Zelensky's description of that call was very different.
How so?
He called it a very important and fruitful conversation, much more positive framing.
Okay, interesting contrast. What did they talk about?
According to the reports, they discussed the current situation, including Russian airstrikes and the broader frontline developments. So, directly addressing the crisis at hand.
Makes sense.
And Zelensky apparently expressed gratitude, noting that President Trump is very well informed, and I thank him for his attention to Ukraine. Which suggests a positive dynamic in that specific conversation. Maybe a feeling of being heard.
That probably helped, you'd think, especially after the apparent frustration with Putin.
It likely played a role, yes. A sense of collaboration there.
And was there a key outcome from that call?
Yes. According to Zelensky, they spoke about opportunities in air defense and agreed that we will work together to strengthen protection of our skies.
Air defense. That's critical, right? Directly relevant to the massive missile and drone attacks they were suffering.
Exactly. So, not just a general chat, but focused on that specific urgent military need, addressing the immediate threat.
And what about Trump's tone after that call? Was it different from his comments about Putin?
Markedly different, based on the reporting. After the Zelensky call, Mr. Trump's own remarks were notably positive about helping Ukraine.
Okay.
He told reporters on Air Force One, "We've been helping them and will continue to help them," which signals a clear shift towards resuming, maybe even increasing, aid.
And did he mention specifics? Like those Patriots?
He did. He specifically suggested the U.S. would sell more Patriot missiles to Ukraine. He even emphasized how effective they are. They're amazingly effective, and the urgent need, saying they're going to need something because they're being hit pretty hard.
Wow. So mentioning Patriot missiles specifically, that's huge, given they were likely part of the pause just days earlier.
It really reinforces the idea of an immediate, direct, responsive shift. Not just a vague promise, but pointing to the exact systems needed to counter the threat they'd just faced.
So if you connect the dots, the huge Russian attack, the unproductive Putin call, the seemingly fruitful Zelensky call focusing on air defense, and then this immediate policy reversal with specific mention of Patriots, it paints a really clear picture, doesn't it?
It does. A picture of very reactive decision-making happening in real time.
Like a direct causal chain. Event, interaction, perception, immediate policy change. Overriding whatever was planned or decided just days before.
Yeah, that's a key insight here, I think. Seeing how that immediate shift in presidential sentiment, seemingly driven by the intensity of the fighting and the different outcomes of those two calls,
Right.
led to such a rapid policy change. It really illustrates the dynamic, sometimes unpredictable nature of foreign policy in a crisis. Personal interactions, real-time events can just suddenly push aside established positions, or even those internal concerns about resources we talked about.
It highlights that tension, doesn't it, between long-term strategic planning and the immediate demands of a crisis that's unfolding right now.
Absolutely. The urgent often overrides the important, or at least the previously important.
Okay, so that brings us nicely to the broader context, the implications of all this.
hmm
Because as we said, this wasn't just a small adjustment. It was a pretty dramatic departure from Trump's consistent stance over many months.
Which makes the reversal even more significant, yeah.
Let's just quickly reiterate his historical position on Ukraine aid before this. The sources remind us he has often expressed skepticism of U.S. aid to Ukraine. That's not news, right? That's been a consistent theme.
No, not news at all. That track record is critical to understanding the magnitude of this pivot. Like you mentioned earlier, that incident months ago where he reportedly, quote, dressed down President Zelensky, claiming he had been insufficiently grateful.
Right.
That highlights a pattern, doesn't it? Skepticism, maybe a transactional view of aid. So this recent sudden embrace of urgent military help is a really significant shift in his public approach, and likely his private calculation, too.
It underscores that whatever happened the attacks, the calls must have been incredibly powerful to overcome those ingrained positions or grievances.
It certainly suggests that for this leader, the sheer force of events and those direct personal interactions can outweigh long-held policy leanings.
It makes it clear this wasn't an easy or automatic decision for him, based on his past. But it's not just about his personal views, is it? There's also the domestic political angle here. Aid to Ukraine is divisive.
Very much so. The sources state it clearly. The issue of whether to supply military aid to Ukraine has bitterly divided Republicans for months.
So it's not like his party was united behind sending more aid.
Not at all. There's fierce opposition coming from some of Mr. Trump's most vocal supporters, often the very people who align with his previous skepticism on foreign aid.
Right.
So connecting that to the bigger picture, it highlights those complex domestic pressures that are always part of foreign policy. This reversal wasn't just about events overseas. It might also have involved some calculation about internal political costs and benefits.
Or maybe a rereading of public opinion.
Possibly. Or it could be seen as the leader deciding to act on his own assessment, despite those internal divisions, kind of asserting his autonomy in foreign policy.
Either way, it adds another layer of complexity. Shows that foreign policy decisions are never made in a purely international vacuum.
Never. Domestic politics are always there.
So what does this whole episode, this rapid shift, tell you, the listener, about how foreign policy actually gets made, especially in real time, under pressure?
Well, it definitely shines a light on the sheer fluidity, the adaptability, or maybe reactivity of policy when geopolitical realities shift quickly, especially in a crisis.
Yeah.
The fact that the decision to pause aid, driven by Pentagon concerns and a presidential directive, could be completely reversed just days later by another presidential directive, this time influenced by battlefield events and personal calls. That says a lot.
It suggests top-level perceptions of urgency can just override everything else.
It seems they can. They can override established protocols, maybe long-term strategic plans, even those domestic political calculations we just talked about. It implies that in these moments, the carefully constructed what-if plans get thrown out the window in favor of what is happening right now.
It also really highlights the power of individual leaders, doesn't it? Their immediate frustrations, their perceptions, their direct conversations, they can drive huge strategic decisions.
Absolutely. Potentially overriding established policy lines or advice from within the system. It's not always about grand strategies playing out over years. Sometimes it really is about a leader's gut reaction to a tough phone call or the impact of seeing news reports about devastating attacks.
And that can speed up decision-making incredibly fast.
Unprecedentedly fast sometimes, which raises a really important question for anyone watching global affairs.
Okay.
Does this kind of highly responsive, event-driven foreign policy, even if it seems effective right in the moment, actually provide stability in the long run? Or does it create more uncertainty for allies and adversaries alike?
That's a good question. What do you mean?
Well, for allies needing help now, like Ukraine in this instance, such rapid changes bringing swift support might be very welcome, very reassuring. But for others, maybe allies trying to plan long-term, or even adversaries trying to predict U.S. moves, it could create significant unpredictability. It makes it harder to rely on consistent long-term commitments if policy can pivot so quickly.
So it impacts trust and reliability down the line.
Potentially, yes.
Yes.
How do rapid pivots affect that long-term trust? It forces everyone, allies, opponents, observers, to pay intense attention, not just to stated policy, but to immediate events and leadership moods, maybe more than established doctrines.
So that adaptability could be seen as both a strength, reacting fast to crises,
Right.
but maybe also a weakness in building those stable, enduring international relationships.
That's the tension, exactly. It's a fascinating dynamic to watch.
It really is. This whole case study just shows that foreign policy isn't always some slow, deliberate machine grinding away. Sometimes it's nimble, almost impulsive, driven by immediate events and strong leadership reactions. Keeps everyone on their toes.
Including us, trying to understand it.
Definitely. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just quickly recap the journey we took you on.
Sounds good.
We started with that initial quiet pause in U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Remember, that was driven by concerns about stockpiles initiated by the president himself.
Right, the background context.
Then we saw those dramatic escalating events in Ukraine, specifically that huge drone and missile attack, which really seems to have been the critical catalyst.
Trigger point.
And finally, the abrupt, very public reversal, driven again by presidential directives, but this time shaped by, well, frustrating calls with Putin, seemingly positive calls with Zelensky, and the sheer horror of the attacks.
And through that, we've hopefully uncovered some key insights for you about how modern foreign policy works.
Yeah.
We've seen that immediate, profound impact of global events on high-level decisions, forcing rapid rethinks. We've touched on those underlying domestic political pressures, showing decisions aren't made in isolation. And crucially, we've highlighted that really dynamic, sometimes highly reactive nature of international aid in wartime. It underscores that even policies that seem set can pivot incredibly quickly when leaders perceive a critical shift or maybe feel a personal diplomatic effort has failed.
And we really hope this helps you, the listener, kind of dissect how all these pieces fit together. Global events, leadership personalities, domestic politics, and how they intertwine to shape these huge life and death decisions.
It's not just abstract theory. It's about real people making calls with real consequences.
Exactly, and how fast that landscape can change. So that leaves us with a final thought to maybe chew on as we all continue to watch these complex global events unfold. Given this swift, seemingly reactive policy shift we've just unpacked, where an immediate crisis and personal interactions can just fundamentally change the direction, what does this deep dive really suggest about the future of international security?
That's a big question.
It is. How do leaders effectively balance those long-term strategic goals with the immediate, unforeseen crises that demand these kinds of rapid pivots? And maybe most critically, how do nations build lasting partnerships and maintain credibility in a world where foreign policy might just turn on a single weekend's events, or even a leader's single frustrated phone call?
Definitely something to think about. The tension between responsiveness and predictability.
Yeah, something to mull over until our next deep dive.